Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every Friday looking at the events of the past. Today on History Calling, we're travelling back to the east coast of the United States in the early 20th century to look at the case of Mary Mallon, more commonly remembered as Typhoid Mary. Was this asymptomatic carrier of typhoid who caused repeated outbreaks of the disease wherever she worked as a cook, an innocent killer who didn't realise what she was doing, or a selfish and thoughtless villain who knew the risk she posed to those around her but refused to change her lifestyle? This video will offer some answers. Make sure you stay to the end too to hear why much of what we think we know about Mary's background and early life, details which you'll often see repeated in books and other documentaries about her, is in fact most likely false. In the winter of 1906, George A. Soper, an epidemiologist and sanitations engineer, was called to the home of a Mr. George Thompson in Oyster Bay, Long Island, to investigate an outbreak of typhoid fever which had occurred there a few months earlier in August and September. Soper was well qualified for the job. He had assisted in dealing with an outbreak of 1,300 cases in Ithaca in 1903 and 600 cases the following year in Watertown. In the Oyster Bay incident, 6 out of the 11 people who comprised the household renting the property at the time had come down with the illness, and Thompson was worried that if the root cause was not discovered, he would be unable to rent the house out during the next summer. Soper carried out extensive investigations, and one by one all the usual causes of such outbreaks were ruled out. It wasn't the milk or cream used by the household, nor was the water supply, which originated in a well, contaminated. For a time, locally sourced clams seemed like a possibility, but just as with the milk and cream, they were eaten by other households nearby where no typhoid had emerged, and Soper was confident they were not the cause. Likewise, he ruled out fruit and vegetables, which had also been consumed by many local people who were not affected. Soper had heard of so-called asymptomatic carriers of illness, though, who could harbour germs and pass them to others without showing any symptoms themselves. And with this theory in mind, he now began to research the occupants of the house during the period of the outbreak. He soon discovered that the summer tenants had hired a new cook on the 4th of August 1906, 23 days before the first case of typhoid emerged. Her name was Mary Mallon, and she was described as an unmarried Irish woman of about 40 years of age, in good health, tall and somewhat heavy. She was not sociable with the other servants, and though a good cook, was not considered very clean in her personal habits. She had left the household about 3 weeks after typhoid broke out. Soper also now suspected how the typhoid germs might have been passed to the victims, through a dessert of fresh peaches in ice cream. This was significant because the dessert required no cooking, which would have destroyed the germs. Mary had been hired through the employment agency Mrs. Stricker's, found on 28th Street, though it was actually run by a man using a pseudonym, and it gave her an excellent reference, but her previous employers had not been spoken with by her new ones. Using the information provided by Stricker's, Soper set about reconstructing Mary's movements as completely and as far back as he was able. When he was done, the patchy timeline he had constructed for her made for sobering reading. Soper was able to fill in much, though not all, of the preceding 10 years of Mary's life, and it was apparent that she left a trail of typhoid almost everywhere she went. From 1897 until 1900, she had worked for a family which had holidayed in Mamaroneck in the summer of 1900. A young man visited the house, and 10 days later, on the 4th of September, he presented with symptoms of typhoid. At the time, the case was blamed on the house's proximity to the Montauk Army camp. Soper would later say that he had only found one household, presumably this one, where Mary hadn't quickly caused typhoid, and his reasoning was that the 2 occupants and one other servant were all elderly and probably already immune to the disease, having caught it earlier in life. In 1901 to 1902, Mary lived for 11 months with a family in New York City. On the 9th of December 1901, their laundress was hospitalized with typhoid. In later 1902, she was in Dark Harbour, Maine, in the household of prominent New York lawyer Coleman Drayton, who was holidaying there for the summer with his family. On the 17th of June, 2 weeks after she began her employment, the first case of typhoid emerged. In all, 7 out of the 9 members of the household would succumb. Only Mary and Drayton himself, who had previously had typhoid, escaped. Together, they nursed the others back to health, and a grateful Drayton gave Mary a $50 bonus in addition to her wages for her assistance, a considerable sum in those days. In 1904, she was working for a Mr. Henry Gilsay at Sands Point, Long Island. She arrived on the 1st of June, and a week later the laundress fell ill with typhoid. 3 others out of the household of 11 would follow. We then have the outbreak in Oyster Bay in August-September 1906, with which I opened this video, before Mary moved on to Tuxedo, where she worked from the 21st of September to the 27th of October 1906. Once again, within a fortnight of her arrival, typhoid came to the house, hospitalizing yet another laundress. With this list of disasters in hand, Soper now knew he had to find Mary. He finally caught up with her on Park Avenue, but it was too late to stop the pattern repeating itself for a 7th and tragic time. Already the household's laundress had been taken to hospital with typhoid, and her employer's only child, a daughter, was dying of the disease. She would pass away on the 23rd of February 1907. However, when Soper approached Mary, she was not just unhelpful, she was violent. He spoke with her in the kitchen of her employer's home, explained what he thought was happening, and asked her to submit to testing to establish if his theory was correct. Instead, she chased him from the room, and indeed the building, with a carving fork. Soper tried again. Having learned that Mary frequented the rooms of a male friend living on 3rd Avenue below 33rd Street, an individual who Soper would later describe as a disreputable-looking man, he and a colleague, Dr. Bert Raymond Hubler, went to see Mary there one evening, without forewarning her. When she arrived, Soper attempted to explain the situation to her again, and requested her help. But again, she refused to listen to anything he had to say, or consider the idea that she might be responsible for the typhoid outbreaks which had been following her around since at least 1900. She insisted that she had never had typhoid, that she was healthy, that she had even helped to nurse the Dark Harbour victims, and that no one had ever accused her of making anyone ill. Soper and Hubler left with Mary, shouting and cursing at them as they went. Now desperate and aware that Mary was going to leave her Park Avenue situation and disappear again, Soper went to the New York City Health Department and recommended that they detain her while they still could. They agreed to do so. Dr. Sarah Josephine Baker was sent to take custody of Mary, but the cook slammed the door in her face. Undeterred, the next day, the 20th of March 1907, Baker went back with a Department of Health ambulance and 3 policemen. 2 of these policemen were left outside in order to stop Mary escaping. The other went with Baker to the door. What followed strongly resembled a farce, as Mary made a run for it. When Miss Mallon opened the door and saw who it was, she tried to close it again, but the policeman in front of her put his foot in the way, and he and Dr. Baker made it into the house. Mary ran back into the kitchen and disappeared. Baker and the policeman followed, but couldn't find her there or elsewhere in the house, and the other servants, perhaps out of misguided loyalty, denied having seen her. Baker then saw a chair in the backyard up against the fence, which separated the property from its neighbour. The other house was checked and searches of the streets were made, but still there was no sign of the runaway cook. 3 hours passed, and Baker was in despair when suddenly a scrap of gingham material was seen sticking out of the door of an outhouse on the neighbour's property. There were ash cans piled up against the door, presumably placed there by other servants hoping to help Mary evade capture, but when they were removed and the door was opened, there she was. Dr. Baker described what happened next. She fought and struggled and cursed. I tried to explain to her that I only wanted the specimens and that then she could go back home. She again refused, and I told the policemen to pick her up and put her in the ambulance. This we did, and the ride down to the hospital was quite a wild one. In fact, Baker would later reveal that she literally had to sit on Mary Mallon to stop her escaping. Mary was now in custody and in isolation at the Willard Parker Hospital. When her stool was checked, it was found that, just as Soper had suspected, she was what he called a living culture tube and chronic typhoid germ producer. Most likely she had contracted typhoid earlier in life, possibly without even realizing it herself, and this had caused her to become a permanent carrier of the disease. He went to visit her for a 3rd time in the starkly white room she was being held in. He told her that he wanted to help her get out of the hospital and that it was her own obstinacy which had brought her there in the first place, for if she had just helped when she was asked, such drastic measures wouldn't have had to be taken against her. No one thought she had infected people knowingly or purposefully, but surely she must now see, in view of the results of the tests run, that he was right and she was wrong. He explained to her that she was passing on typhoid by not properly cleaning her hands after using the toilet and before cooking, which allowed germs to pass from her feces to her hands to the food she was preparing. He recommended that she allow her gallbladder to be removed, as this was the likely source of the typhoid in her system. Mary didn't say a word to any of this. Instead, after Soper had finished talking and offering to help her if she would just work with him, she went into her toilet and shut the door. And that was that. Soon afterwards, she was moved to North Brother Island, where she was given a small cottage and kept in isolation, her food being delivered to her to be eaten alone. Her case was reported in the press, but her identity protected by giving her the pseudonym Mary Ilverson. 2 years went by, still with no improvement in Mary's diagnosis, and her continuing refusal to have her gallbladder removed, which, given that it was only the early 1900s, may have been a wise decision. She could easily have died from post-operative complications. Then, in 1909, and with the help of a lawyer named George Francis O'Neill, she sued the city of New York for release. A letter she wrote, apparently during this time, still survives, in which she complains about her treatment and the way in which the various doctors managing her case have handled her. I'll leave a link to the original in the description box so you can see her handwriting. It reads, "In reply to Dr. Park of the Board of Health, I will state that I am not segregated with the typhoid patients. There is nobody on this island that has typhoid. There was never any effort by the board authority to do anything for me excepting to cast me on the island and keep me a prisoner without being sick nor needing medical treatment. When I first came here, they took 2 blood cultures and feces went down 3 times per week, say Monday, Wednesday and Friday respectively, until the latter part of June. After that they only got the feces once a week, which was on Wednesday. Now they have given me a record for nearly a year for 3 times a week. When I first came here, I was so nervous and almost prostrated with grief and trouble. My eyes began to twitch and the left eyelid became paralysed and would not move. It remained in that condition for 6 months. There was an eye specialist who visited the island 3 and 4 times a week. He was never asked to visit me. I did not even get a cover for my eye. I had to hold my hand on it whilst going about and at night tie a bandage on it. In December, when Dr. Wilson took charge, he came to me and I told him about it. He said that was news to him and that he would send me his electric battery, but he never sent it. However, my eye got better thanks to the Almighty God and in spite of the medical staff. Dr. Wilson ordered me Urotropin. I got that on and off for a year. Sometimes they had it and sometimes they did not. I took the Urotropin for about 3 months all told during the whole year. If I should have continued it, it would certainly have killed me, for it was very severe. Everyone knows who is acquainted in any kind of medicine that it's used for kidney trouble. When in January 1908 they were about to discharge me, when the resident physician came to me and asked me where was I going when I got out of here. Naturally I said to New York, so there was a stop put to my getting out of here. Then the supervising nurse told me I was a hopeless case, and if I'd write to Dr. Darlington and tell him I'd go to my sister's in Connecticut. Now I have no sister in that state or any other in the US. Then, in April, a friend of mine went to Dr. Darlington and asked him when I was to get away. He replied, "That woman is all right now, and she is a very expensive woman, but I cannot let her go myself. The board has to sit. Come around Saturday." When he did, Dr. Darlington told this man, "I've nothing more to do with this woman. Go to Dr. Stutterford." He went to that doctor and he said, "I cannot let that woman go, and all the people that she gave the typhoid to, and so many deaths occurred in the families she was with." Dr. Stutterford said to this man, "Go and ask Mary Mallon and inveigle her to have an operation performed to have her gallbladder removed. I'll have the best surgeon in town to do the cutting." I said, "No, no knife will be put on me. I've nothing the matter with my gallbladder." Dr. Wilson asked me the very same question. I also told him no. Then he replied, "It might not do you any good." Also, the supervising nurse asked me to have an operation performed. I also told her no, and she made the remark, "Would it not be better for you to have it done than remain here?" I told her no. There is a visiting doctor who came here in October. He did take quite an interest in me. He really thought I liked it here, that I did not care for my freedom. He asked me if I'd take some medicine if he brought it to me. I said I would. So he brought me some anti-autotox and some pills then. Dr. Wilson had already ordered me brewer's yeast. At first I would not take it, for I'm a little afraid of the people, and I have a good right, for when I came to the department, they said they were in my intestinal tract. Later another said they were in the muscles of my bowels, and latterly they thought of the gallbladder. I have been in fact a peep show for everybody. Even the interns had to come to see me and ask about the facts already known to the whole wide world. The tuberculosis men would say, there she is, the kidnapped woman. Dr. Park has had me illustrated in Chicago. I wonder how the said Dr. William H. Park would like to be insulted and put in the journal and call him or his wife Typhoid William Park. Mary Mallon. The newspapers picked up on her bid for freedom and reported that she complained that she was treated like a leper, that she was allowed to see no one except a dog, and that her food was brought to her 3 times a day by a nurse who left it at the door, then practically ran away. All this despite the fact that she had committed no crime and had had no trial. There was considerable sympathy for her plight amongst the press, though, as she alluded to in her letter, they were by now calling her Typhoid Mary, which she hated, and her real name and photograph had been released. But Judge Geigerick, while expressing sympathy for her situation too, ultimately refused to release her, citing the risk to public health. The following year, however, a new health commissioner did let her go, with a promise that she would never work as a cook again and that she would report to public health officials every 3 months. At first, Mary abided by these terms, staying in New York and suing the city and its health department for $50,000 for wrongful imprisonment in 1911. In 1912, however, she dropped this suit and disappeared, in violation of her release agreement. She resurfaced in early 1915 under the name Maria Breshof or Mrs. Brown, and when it was discovered what she had done in the intervening years, there was little sympathy left for her. Mary's reappearance was preceded by a mass outbreak of typhoid at the Sloane Women's Hospital on West 59th Street, where 25 people had come down with the disease. According to newspaper reports of the time, 2 had even died. Some of the staff had jokingly taken to calling their new cook, Mrs. Brown, Typhoid Mary, and the nickname was enough for Dr. Edward Cragen, who was the head obstetrician and gynecologist at the hospital, to phone George Soper and ask him to come to the hospital and identify a sample of Mary's handwriting while she was away. No doubt those who had joked about who she was were horrified when Soper confirmed that the handwriting and descriptions of the hospital cook did indeed match Mary's writing and appearance. Mary ran again, first to New Jersey, then Long Island, but she was soon located and it became clear just how flagrantly she had breached the terms of her release. She was promptly taken back into custody and returned to North Brother Island. Just as with the ice cream and peaches nearly a decade earlier, it was suspected that it was Mary's preparation of a cold, gelatin-based dessert which had precipitated the Sloane Hospital outbreak. According to Soper, in a 1939 paper he gave on the case, she had also worked in a restaurant on Broadway, a hotel in Southampton, an inn at Huntington, a fashionable hotel in New Jersey, and a sanatorium in New Jersey. The last case was in 1914 and had produced 2 cases of typhoid. There had also been a spell with a family in New York. Soper found Mary's attitude and actions hard to explain, as indeed do I. In a 1919 article in the Military Surgeon Journal, he wrote that she took chances both with the lives of other people and with her own prospect for liberty, and that she did this deliberately and in a hospital where the risk of detection and severe punishment were particularly great, argues a mental attitude which is difficult to explain. Other than her mind-boggling recklessness with the lives of unsuspecting victims, Soper felt that Mary was otherwise intelligent. She read widely and possessed good handwriting and composition skills in letter writing, but she had a complete mental block when it came to her typhoid status, despite the overwhelming evidence that she was a carrier. Rather than believe in or admit to her illness, she preferred to argue that everyone else was wrong and that she was right, and continued to do as she pleased. It's hard to know if this was the result of stupidity and selfishness, or if she had some sort of mental health problem which contributed to her attitude. In his later paper in 1939, Soper attributed her wholesale disregard for the welfare of others in the years before 1915 to the fact that though she had tried other means of income, such as ironing and running a boarding house, the ironing didn't pay as well as cooking, and she was so bad at running the boarding house that it was a financial failure too. Personally, I doubt that even she really believed that the typhoid cases weren't her fault. Even before her initial discovery back in January 1907, the speed with which she moved from job to job, her habit of changing her name, and her reluctance to give any information about her past suggest that she knew herself to be the cause of both the outbreaks we know about and others which are now lost to history. The Sloane Hospital fiasco did at least prove to be the end of the road for this super-spreader, however, as after 1915 she would be given no more chances to roam free and take on domestic work. Mary spent the remainder of her life in her island quarantine. She was given a job in the laboratory at Riverside Hospital and was eventually allowed to make unaccompanied day trips to the mainland, from which she always returned. In many ways her life, with her own cottage and her food and income needs taken care of on the island, with a hospital right next door to her and occasional visits into the city, was better than many others living in New York and elsewhere at the time. Having never been a particularly sociable person, and as someone who moved around constantly and always denied that she had any family in the US, there were few people for her to miss once she was back in quarantine. She got along well enough with the staff on the island and made a life there. In 1932, she was discovered on the floor of her little house, having suffered a paralysing stroke which permanently robbed her of the ability to walk. The remainder of her life was spent in Riverside Hospital, where she died at around 1 p.m. on the 11th of November 1938. The primary causes of death were listed as bronchopneumonia lasting 7 days, chronic nephritis and chronic myocarditis lasting 10 years. Typhoid lasting 24 years was given as a contributing factor, even though Mary had never displayed any symptoms of it and no autopsy was carried out. She was buried in St. Raymond Cemetery in the Bronx after a Roman Catholic service at St. Luke's Church on 138th Street. The funeral was attended by only 9 people who declined to give their names to reporters. Her headstone, still in place today, simply reads, Mary Mallon, died November 11, 1938, with the words, Jesus Mercy at the bottom and images of a cross and flowers on the right-hand side. I've left a link to a picture of it in the description box. The total number of cases attributed to Mary varies slightly from source to source, but appears to have been 53, with 3 fatalities. The true number is surely much higher, but will never be known as so much of Mary's life and movements remain unclear. Even her death certificate, which I've also left linked in the description box, is mysterious. It records that she was born on the 23rd of September 1869 in Ireland to a John Mallon and a Catherine Igo. Other secondary sources are more precise. A book by Judith Walser-Levitt says that she was born in Cookstown, County Tyrone, but the only source for the information is listed as John Concannon, National Historian of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. There is no indication where he got the information. Furthermore, this birthday, place of birth, and the parents' names are not borne out by the Irish birth certificates, which are now fully digitised and freely available online and which I've checked. My conclusion, in the absence of further evidence, is that Mary fabricated this family background when asked by those around her where she was from. There were also stories that she emigrated to the US at the age of 15 and initially lived with an aunt, but like her birth details, I've seen nothing to prove these rumours, except that her death certificate says she'd been in the US for 55 years, making her 14 at the time of moving there. Ultimately, I suspect these stories also came from Mary herself. We therefore do not know for sure what her name, age, or place of birth was, or anything she did before 1897. Though based on reports that she had an Irish accent and was telling people that was where she hailed from, even before she became well known, I strongly suspect she was indeed from somewhere in the northern portion of the island. Cookstown is now in Northern Ireland, and so for her story that she was from the north of the country to be believable, Mary's accent must have sounded almost exactly like my own. And as all the questions I get about my voice in the comments section of my videos go to show, it's quite a distinctive accent and not particularly easy to fake or confuse with others, especially given how many people heard Mary speak and could attest to what she sounded like. Furthermore, there would have been little point in her pretending to be Irish, given the persecution they faced in New York and other areas of the United States at the time, as you can see from this 1915 anti-Irish sign from Boston. Mary herself did claim on occasion to have been born in the United States. However, Judith Walser-Levitt says that a check of the New York birth records found nothing, though of course she could have been born elsewhere. No one ever came forward claiming to be related to her, though Soper twice thought that he had spoken to her sister during his investigations, but gave no reason why he suspected this. Perhaps it was something this mysterious woman said. Perhaps she sounded Northern Irish too, or maybe he thought he saw a familial resemblance. We'll never know. As you heard in her letter a few minutes ago, Mary, for her part, strenuously denied having any sister in the US. So what do you make of this story? Do you believe that it was right that Mary, despite having committed no crime, was locked up without charge or trial? There were, after all, other known silent carriers of disease in her era, but none were treated as harshly as her, and she was correct that detaining her in this way broke her constitutional rights. Perhaps her gender, social class and Irishness, real or not, counted against her in a time when poor women from the Emerald Isle were not well thought of as a rule in society. Perhaps her troubles with doctors and the law were simply down to her own pig-headedness in refusing to cooperate with them or obey even basic sanitary habits, despite working as a cook and, after 1907, knowing how important it was for her to be clean. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so you never miss an upload. You can also follow me on Instagram, where my username is HistoryCalling. There's a link for that in the description box. If strange medical history is your thing, check out my videos on the dancing plague and on the story of Marie Antoinette's hair, which supposedly turned white the night before her death. For something different, why not try my 6 Wives of Henry VIII playlist? Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.